Donald Trump and Mike Pence declared Juan Guaidó, a Venezuelan politician known to less than 1 in 5 Venezuelans, president of Venezuela, despite the fact that Venezuela already has a president, Nicolas Maduro. Washington doesn't care though. Washington loves Guaidó, even if not everyone has learned his name yet.
The interim president Juan Guaidó will have the resources he needs to lead the government of Venezuela forward.
So the US is trying to unseat yet another democratically elected head of state and put their own puppet in power. We've certainly never heard of this before. Chile, Iran, Nicaragua, Cuba, Congo, Korea, Angola, Libya. Sorry, my allergies have been acting up.
What?
My allergies? I'm allergic to war. It's a pretty common allergy. So who is Juan Guaidó, and why was he chosen to carry out this coup? An expose written by Max Blumenthal and Dan Cohen from the Gray Zone Project reveals some pretty damning answers. As with most US-backed puppet rulers, Guaidó was groomed in an American university. He moved to Washington, D.C. to enroll in the Governance and Political Management program at George Washington University under the tutelage of Venezuelan economist Luis Enrique Berisbeitia, one of the top Latin American neoliberal economists. Berisbeitia is a former executive director of the International Monetary Fund who spent more than a decade working in the Venezuelan energy sector under the old oligarchic regime that was ousted by Chavez. Berisbeitia was a former executive director at the IMF and was one of many economists that provided an ideological justification for the exploitative neoliberal economic system in Venezuela prior to the election of Hugo Chavez. George Washington University has a history of cultivating operatives of regime change. Syngman Rhee, the US-backed dictator of the newly created Republic of Korea, studied at GW. Rhee brought the Korean peninsula back under partial Japanese rule after Korean socialists had kicked the Japanese colonizers off the peninsula. In the same way, Guaidó was educated so he could one day plunge Venezuela back into the pre-Chavez neoliberal period, which was rife with massive poverty, inflation, and economic exploitation by foreign capitalists. GW's mascot is, quite appropriately, the GW Colonial. What a creep. That year, Guaidó helped lead anti-government rallies after the Venezuelan government declined to renew the license of Radio Caracas television. This privately owned station played a leading role in the 2002 coup against Hugo Chavez. RCTV helped mobilize anti-government demonstrators, falsified information blaming government supporters for acts of violence carried out by opposition members, and banned pro-government reporting amid the coup. The role of RCTV and other oligarch-owned stations in driving the failed coup attempt was chronicled in the acclaimed documentary The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. That same year, Guaidó began cultivating his reputation as an activist of the Venezuelan right wing. Guaidó led protests after the Venezuelan government refused to renew the license for Radio Caracas television, or RCTV, an opposition propaganda outlet that was known to doctor footage. Guaidó and his fellow classmates also protested Chavez's constitutional referendum to create 21st century socialism. One member of this group, Jan Guaicochea, was awarded the Milton Friedman Prize for Advancing Liberty and $500,000 by Koch brother-funded libertarian think tank the Cato Institute for his actions, which helped successfully tank the constitutional referendum. These actions brought notoriety to Guaidó and his clique, which began calling themselves Generation 2007. Just how successful was Generation 2007? Well, they got the attention of the State Department, National Security Council, and Department of Defense. A leaked email sent by US Ambassador to Venezuela, William Brownfield, shows Generation 2007 was on the radar of these departments. The email notes, "The emerging Generation 07 does not appear to pose a real threat to Chavez's rule, but it has successfully tapped popular discontent with Chavez's decision to close RCTV and expose Chavez's autocratic tendencies and democratic deficiencies. It has also forced the Venezuelan president, accustomed to setting the political agenda, to overreact." This email proves the United States had carefully groomed Guaidó and his friends for over a decade and waited for the perfect moment to push him forward into the spotlight as the leader of the opposition. The email also acknowledges the primary strategy of regime change in Venezuela to intentionally elicit responses to opposition activity, which can then be framed as political persecution or authoritarianism. This tactic can be seen even today as right-wing protesters throw Molotov cocktails at Venezuelan police to try to elicit a violent response. Guaidó exposed himself to the public in another way. founding a political party to capture the anti-Chavez energy his Generation 07 had cultivated. Called Popular Will, it was led by Leopoldo Lopez, a Princeton-educated right-wing firebrand heavily involved in the National Endowment for Democracy programs and elected as the mayor of a district in Caracas that was one of the wealthiest in the country. Lopez was a portrait of Venezuelan aristocracy, directly descended from his country's first president. He was also the first cousin of Thor Halvorsen, founder of the US-based Human Rights Foundation that functions as a de facto publicity shop for US-backed anti-government activists in countries targeted by Washington for regime change. So the founding of Guaidó's party was directly tied to American moneyed interests. Popular Will's plan to take power was simple. A leaked Popular Will email reads as follows. A key to Chavez's current weakness is the decline in the electricity sector. There's the grave possibility that some 70% of the country's electricity grid could go as dark as soon as April 2010. This could be the watershed event, as there's little that Chavez could do to protect the poor from the failure of that system. This would likely have the impact of galvanizing public unrest in a way that no opposition group could ever hope to generate. At that point in time, an opposition group would be best served to take advantage of the situation and spin it against Chavez and towards their needs. Also worth noting is that the US Agency for International Development's regime change arm, the National Endowment for Democracy, was funding the Venezuelan opposition to the tune of $40 to $50 million a year at this point in time. This all culminated in a second push to oust a Bolivarian leader, this time Nicolas Maduro, in 2014. The Venezuelan government captured documents which detailed a plot by opposition supporter Maria Corina Machado to assassinate Nicolas Maduro. Machado previously served as a representative of the opposition to George W. Bush's administration. In 2014, Guaidó was on the ground in Venezuela organizing violent protests in barricaded opposition neighborhoods called guarimbas.
Aquí seguimos, luego de 5 horas, aquí seguimos, Francisco de Miranda, full de gente. Vemos hacia abajo, hacia la autopista, también mucha gente resistiendo. Recuerdo que en el 2007 gritamos estudiantes, hoy gritamos resistencia, nuestra resistencia. Vamos que sí se puede.
Guarimbas often clashed with the police. This was a period of intense violence in which dozens of people died. Guarimbas are known for their use of violent tactics such as burning people alive and using steel wire to decapitate motorcyclists. The Venezuelan government understandably cracked down on those involved in the violence, many of whom were members of the Popular Will Party. Popular Will's leadership, people like Juan Goycochea, Freddy Guevara, Lester Toledo, and Leopoldo Lopez were charged with their respective roles in the violence. Some were arrested, some fled the country, and some took up lucrative speaking gigs at groups like Human Rights Watch. With much of Generation 2007 and Popular Will's leadership marred by the legacy of the violence in 2014, Juan Guaidó was one of the only Popular Will members left to carry out the decades-long plot to replace the Bolivarian leader. Guaidó maintained a relatively low profile as a legislator in the National Assembly starting in 2015. While he's hailed as the president of the National Assembly in the media, he only held this seat because the 4 opposition parties in the National Assembly decided that this seat should be on a rotation. In hindsight, it's clear why Trump made this move while Guaidó, and not someone else, was in this seat. He was their familiar agent, their guy on the inside. One day before that fateful day when Juan Guaidó declared himself president of Venezuela, Mike Pence called Guaidó to assure him that if he declared himself the new president of Venezuela, the US would have his back. And the rest, as they say, is history. Pence and Trump kept their promise, and the once-libertarian GW grad student went on to fulfill the destiny forged for him by the Koch brothers and the US diplomatic apparatus.